Here are 3 commanders that break the standard mold for their troop types. First, Attila breaks the cavalry mold of being fragile and weak to swarm. So many Cav commanders even now are saddled with a weakness to swarm. Whether you talk about Khan, William, Joan, or even Jadwiga, the cavalry is typically categorized as being right next to archers and being weak to swarm. Enter Attila with the huge normal damage and such staying power that he's even now used years after release. It's easy to see why his sheer ability to resist swarm and wreak havoc on enemies is so wanted. Next, we have Heraclius. Leadership commanders are typically so weak, and besides YSS, many are relegated to weak positions, if any at all. Enter Hera, upending the whole dynamic and entering the meta at basically every point of Garrisons, to the point that Garrisons are viable based on how well they pair up against him. Lastly, we have Boudica and Hermann, who both break the heavy damage, weak to swarm meta with a genuinely fun kit based around support rather than damage. Here are 3 commanders that are best left as secondaries. Whether it's weak talent selection, increased attention when they're primary, or just generally better synchronization with other commanders' kits. First, we have Heraclius. This should come as no surprise here, as Heraclius' only real weakness is talent selection, so it'd be natural to use him as a secondary as it covers his only real weakness. Next, we have William. William, similarly, has very, very weak talents, but has a great defense buff in AoE, and a generally fragile kit that leave him vulnerable to being swarmed when he runs as a primary, as people are more likely to notice him, leaving him as a better option to just be secondary behind the mountain of great cavalry field commanders that are good primaries. Last, but certainly not least, we have YSG and Liang, who both similarly to William tend to receive a lot of focus when they're primary, leaving them vulnerable to some nasty focus in swarm, leaving them best hidden behind a more intimidating primary commander. This is a Boudica Prime commander review. Boudica Prime is a staple of the field meta, and even with Hermann Prime on the scene, Boudica Prime is still a very solid single target debuffer, as well as a good survivability, and really being weak and lacking on AoE, and that's about it. For talents, I use this setup with the maximized skill tree as you can get the most value, and the versatility tree is pretty bad. For pairings, you can go with an AoE like YSG or Liang to help deter swarmers and put out even more damage, or you can go with another support like Hermann to help double stack debuffs and do insane damage, both with this pair and any other pair targeting your enemies. For the meta, Boudica Prime is still an incredibly solid and great free-to-play option, due to debuffs being so useful at all stages of the game. This is a Trajan Commander review. Trajan is the epitome of a field support, with one of the most powerful active skills in the game, as well as great flexibility to pair with basically any commander in the game if you want to, making him a good support that's only hampered by poor mobility and general fragility. For talents, this is what I like to do with the max support tree, and just getting a little bit more value out of the leadership tree. His versatility tree is pretty bad. For formations, Echelon's a must-have because you gain an additional 5% skill damage, which gives a wedge formation to every ally you buff on top of your already powerful buff. For pairings, you want to pair him with a support like Mulan to double down on Echelon formation, a debuffer like Aethel or Scipio Prime to help support but you lose out on Echelon, or a tank like Alexander to try to help mitigate damage. For the meta, Trajan has such potential, but has a dedicated niche among players who play support heavily and are willing to take the risk to protect him and keep him out of trouble. Welcome to another episode of Boom or Bust. In this episode, we're covering Liang and Constantine. First, Liang is a slight boom. He isn't quite the home run he was worked up as when he was released and hailed as the YSG replacement, but he does a great job covering a lot of the areas where YSG isn't strong, being more survivable and having a bigger individual AoE that admittedly places him in the conversation for all 3 aspects of the game: field, rally, and garrison. Next, Constantine is still a bust. Don't get me wrong, he's great with Gorgo, and he's brought him back into the conversation just on that alone. But upon release, and all the way up until the Gorgo release, he's always been very mediocre, as well as a terrible investment that many infantry mains have regretted at release. Overall, he also stands as a good example of how far the Garrison meta has come since the early stages of the game, and how terribly early Garrisons have aged in the meta. Welcome to another episode of Boom or Bust, Prime Edition, with Hermann and Joan Prime. First, Hermann Prime is a slight bust. Of course, he's incredibly solid in the meta, but his release hype was that of an Archer version of Nevsky, who would basically be the backbone of the Archer meta for the foreseeable future, and Hermann just doesn't seem to be that. While he is good, he isn't quite that good, and the expectations have been dooming his status to being a slight bust versus the hype. Next, Joan Prime is a pretty quiet boom. While there was concern about her survivability, her sheer damage output has just been insane, really cementing her legacy as a meta field commander and making replacing her fairly difficult between her sheer individual abilities and how her ability seems to pair well with basically every meta field commander for the cavalry, and several niches covered as well. This proves that the adage that a jack of all trades but a master of none is oftentimes better than just a master of one. Welcome to a new series that I wanted to cover called the Boris Tip of the Week. I wanted to once a week go back to some old tips that were great tips but newer players might not have experienced. In this video, we're going to be going over KvK training bastions. The training bastion gives you 110,000 points, which means you need to get 11,000 troops of T4 or 5,500 troops of T5. There's a couple ways to do this, but the biggest way is to use expansions and just wait them out. For T5, the best option is generally just go with the 5,000 expansion, because then you can complete 3 of the bastions with the 3 different buildings you're going to be training from. But with T4, to get 11,000 troops, you have some options. If you use all 3 buildings on 2,000 expansions, that'll get you there. Or 2 buildings on 5,000 expansions each will also get you there. Doing this several days in advance or waiting to start the troops till you're almost done will save you a bunch of speed ups, and it will pay off in the long run. This is real life tactics you can use in Rise of Kingdoms. In this episode, we're using the Macedonian Hammer and Anvil. The Hammer and Anvil is a strategy most famously used by Alexander the Great, in which the main force holds the enemy still while a flanking force hits the weaker rear flank of the enemy. With the enemy focused on the main force, the weakened position is quickly overwhelmed, causing a rout. To do this in Rise of Kingdoms, we're going to use territory. The pinning force will open a fort front against the fort or a flag, while the small flanking force will go to a weakened position, which is any exposed single flag that would cut territory. The flanking force will try to cut the flag with a dozen marches or so, which will threaten the enemy with losing their front fort territory or force them to move back to defend the flag. This creates a situation which, when executed properly, results in a positive win with either response. If the enemy doesn't divert, they lose territory, and if they retreat, they concede the front to you. You can also use this in field and ruins to help flank enemies and overwhelm them through this force. Here are the 2 biggest mistakes growing players make that impede their growth in the long run. First is spending gold heads too early on niche commanders. Gold heads are extremely hard to come by, and you'll need a lot of them to expertise commanders, so they should be preserved as much as possible. Early on, you have commanders, but many do not scale to the level of Season of Conquest, potentially wasting those heads in the early game where you could save them and give you a huge leg up on the competition once you get to the Season of Conquest, or once you reach higher T4 or begin to build T5. Second is not using more than gems to your advantage. You'll need to buy books for your castle, blueprints for your buildings, and any number of items as you grow. So using more than gems and planning ahead gives you extra value from more than gems that many players miss out on or just outright forget about by not waiting or planning ahead. Buying for the future allows you to get more value now while being ready to continue your growth later. Here are 3 equipment set pieces that you can replace with leadership gear and not lose a lot. First, we have the infantry leg plates, both the set piece and the alternative piece of which are replaced well by the leg pieces, as the leadership legs give 8% health instead of 12% defense or 11% attack, making it a much better value piece. Next, we have the archer gloves. Similarly, you have a 6% defense leadership item that can replace the 7.5% attack on this piece. So long as you can maintain the 4-piece set for archers for the skill damage bonus, this is a good move you can make, especially if you're not planning on building the Season of Conquest items. Last, but certainly not least, we have the archer leg plates, which, similarly to the infantry leg plates, replace attack with health, which is a solid 8% health, and then a 3% defense bonus if you also replace the gloves, making this a great value piece for archers when possible. Here are 3 things you should always remember when fighting in the field. Whether it's ruins, altars, defending a flag, or pushing an enemy, don't forget these tips. First, stay with your team. There's strength in numbers, so play into that strength. Keep enemies on their toes, and make it harder to pick you specifically out of a crowd. It helps you, frustrates your enemy, and helps your kingdom to succeed better. Second, when pushing, place yourself between where the enemy is coming from and your objective. Want to defend a flag? Put yourself between the flag and the enemy territory. Want to burn their flag? Place yourself between their flag and where they're reinforcing. Your field presence should be a presence. Make your kingdom be felt on the field. Last, but certainly not least, stay focused. Enemies will try to drag you away from the objective and to separate your field team from the objective. Don't take the bait. It's a common tactic to help minimize numbers. So make sure you stay near your markers and hold fast and get your allies back in line when needed. Follow these and you'll be a field marshal in no time. Here are two sets of commanders you didn't know had historical ties. First, we have William and Harold. Harold and William are both involved in claiming the English throne in 1066, and most notably both fought the same person for control of the English throne. While Harold was unsuccessful, William would later ultimately win and become king. However, William would have landed in England much sooner had the wind across the channel not prevented his crossing, making a face-off with Harold possible, just never in the cards. Next, we have Tomyris and Cyrus, who, unlike William and Harold, actually squared off in battle directly, with Tomyris ultimately winning the battle and killing Cyrus in the process, while Tomyris got vengeance for the loss of her captured son. Here are two more sets of commanders you did not know had historical ties. First, we have Flavius and Attila. Flavius and Attila squared off in battle at the Catalonian fields, where Flavius was eventually able to deal a rare defeat to the most feared general of the time in Attila, and to halt a relentless advance of the Huns. Next, we have an interesting one. While many will quote that Richard and Saladin had quite the rivalry back in the Crusades, and they touch base on that a lot in the game, Frederick Barbarossa was also around at that time and was a very involved participant in the Third Crusade, although less highlighted than Saladin and Richard, adding even more depth and tethers to the historical rivalry of Richard and Saladin. Here are yet another pair of commanders you did not know had historical ties. The next one might be a little more obvious here, but Cleopatra and Alexander have one huge tie that unite them, and that's Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic line of Egypt came from the Macedonians, namely the general Ptolemy who laid claim to Egypt upon Alexander's death, creating the Ptolemaic dynasty, and meaning the death of Alexander indirectly created Cleopatra, who is actually more Greek than Egyptian, a common historical misconception. Next, we have Dido and the entirety of Rome. And no, I'm not talking about the Punic Wars, as juicy as that might be of a topic to cover, but rather the mythology of Dido and the Roman Empire intertwine over Aeneas, a Trojan hero who is said to both father Romulus and Remus, as well as had a romantic relationship with Dido, meaning that these two civilizations were intertwined mythologically a lot sooner than one may have thought.